I have had many strange experiences in this line of work, but this specific night takes the cake for being the most terrifying. I was working at a fast food chain called Burger Bites, which was located in a rather small town of Ravenswood. I had been working there for over a year, and my schedule consisted of working night shifts. My co-worker, Jake, was an older man who had a habit of being worried about something all the time. He was in charge of the deliveries during the night shifts and would make all the meals while I would answer calls. I had been working there for over a year, and I was experienced in dealing with difficult customers and weird situations. It was just past 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and I had just gotten back from a delivery when the phone rang. Seeing Jake in the middle of making a meal, I picked up the phone. A customer on the other line placed an order for a large burger meal. I put in the order and asked if he needed anything else. The customer didn't answer for a moment. Then, he repeated himself saying that he'd like a large burger meal. I confirmed the order, and the customer said yes. I sent the order through and grabbed my next delivery and dropped it off. Getting back to the shop, Jake had finished the customer's order and prepped it for delivery, so I grabbed it off the counter and ran to my car. As I was grabbing the order, Jake gave me a worried look, as if he wanted to say something to me, but he decided not to. The address was a good 20 minutes away, but there was no traffic at this time, so I got there pretty early. The house was abandoned and had a strange aura around it. I got out and went around to the passenger door to pick up the meal. Then, I headed up to the porch and knocked. A few seconds later, a man came and opened the door. He was a strange and creepy-looking man with beady eyes and a sinister grin on his face. He looked at the meal with an eerie expression and then looked over my shoulder. Following his gaze, I turned and saw a dark figure standing behind the house. My heart raced and I felt my body go into a state of shock, trying to figure out what to do. I had a bad feeling, but I didn't want to disappoint the customer, and I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The man at the door took the meal from me and handed me the cash without saying a word. Right then I noticed that he had a strange symbol tattooed on his hand, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. As I was leaving, he looked over my shoulder again, and this time, when I turned, I saw the dark figure more clearly. He was a tall, bulky man, and he seemed to be staring right at me. I knew I had to leave as soon as possible, and I quickly made my way back to my car. I got in and locked the doors. But as I was about to start the engine, I realized that he had moved closer. I froze in fear and couldn't move. Meanwhile, he just stood there, staring at me with empty eyes. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I don't know how long I sat there, but it felt like eternity. Eventually, I managed to start the engine and drive away. I was shaking and my heart was racing. I had never felt so scared in my life. When I got back to the shop, I immediately told Jake about the encounter, but he didn't seem to understand. He just told me to take a break and relax. But I couldn't relax. I was still shaken and unable to comprehend what had just happened. I had nightmares about that night for weeks after, and I couldn't bring myself to go back to work. I quit my job shortly after, as I couldn't take the risk of experiencing something like that again. I later found out that the abandoned house was known to be haunted, and many people had reported strange occurrences happening near it. I may never know the real answer, but I do know one thing: that night will forever be ingrained in my memory. I'm a middle-aged man who has been working as a food delivery driver for the past 10 years. I consider myself pretty strong, and I've always been able to handle whatever the job throws at me. But there was one night, about a year ago, that I will never forget. It was a real scary encounter that left me shaken to my core. I've never spoken about it before, but I feel like it's time to tell my story. It was a typical Wednesday night, and I was working my usual shift. I had just finished delivering a pizza to a house on the outskirts of town, and I was headed back to the restaurant to pick up my next order. As I was driving, I noticed that my phone had a low battery and was about to die. Worried, I decided to stop at a rather secluded gas station to charge it. I pulled into the station, parked my car, and plugged my phone in. While waiting, I lit my joint and decided to relax for a tiny bit. As I was sitting there, I noticed a car parked next to the adjacent wall. It was an old, beat-up station wagon that looked like it had seen better days. I didn't think much of it at the time, but something about the car was making me uneasy. Still, I decided to ignore it and instead focus on my phone. After about 10 minutes, I had enough. The feeling of unease seemed to grow stronger, and I decided it would be better to get out of there. I got back in my car, started it up, and pulled out of the gas station. As I was driving away, I saw the old station wagon in my rearview mirror. It was following me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. I figured the driver was just heading in the same direction as me. But as I turned onto the main road, the station wagon turned behind me. I started to feel a sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. I decided to try and lose the car. I turned onto a side street and started driving as fast as I could. But the station wagon was still behind me. By this time I had started to panic. I didn't know what to do. I knew I needed to get away from the car, but I also didn't want to lead it back to the restaurant. I decided to pull into a parking lot and wait for the car to pass. I parked my car, turned off the lights, and waited. But the station wagon didn't pass. It pulled into the parking lot and parked next to me. I was terrified now. I didn't know what to do. I could see a figure in the driver's seat, but I couldn't make out any details. I could see that the figure was turning towards me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I put my car in reverse and floored it. I didn't look back as I drove away. I drove back to the restaurant as fast as I could. I was shaking and sweating by the time I got there. Once there, I told my boss what had happened, and he called the police. They passed the details of the vehicle to troopers who searched the area, but they never found the station wagon. I don't know what happened that night. I have no idea who was in the station wagon or what they wanted. But I do know that it was the most scared I've ever been in my life. To this day, I still don't know who was in that station wagon or what their intentions were. I can only assume that they were up to no good. I quit that job the next day and moved out of town. Since then, I have never looked back. But still to this day, I can't get that night out of my head. It's always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I still sometimes have nightmares about the station wagon and the figure inside. I'm convinced that if I had stayed any longer, something terrible would have happened. I used to work as a delivery guy for a local restaurant called Papa's Pizza in my hometown of New Orleans. It was my first job, and I was only 16 years old when I got hired. I worked there for 2 years until I had a terrifying encounter with a customer that still haunts me to this day. It was a hot summer night in July of 2014. I had just finished my shift at the restaurant and was preparing to make my last delivery of the night. The order was for a house located on the outskirts of town, in a neighborhood known for its old, creaky houses and spooky atmosphere. I remember feeling a bit uneasy as I got into my car, but I shrugged it off and told myself it was just my imagination. When I arrived at the house, I parked my car and got out to grab the pizza from the trunk. As I approached the front door, I noticed that all the lights were off, and there was a strange, eerie feeling in the air. I hesitated for a moment, but I knew I had to make the delivery. I knocked on the door and waited for a response. After a few moments, the door slowly creaked open and I was greeted by an old woman with a pale, gaunt face and dark circles under her eyes. She had a strange, almost haunted look in her eyes, and I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. I nervously introduced myself and handed her the pizza, but she didn't say a word. She just stared at me with those dark, empty eyes and took the pizza from my hands. As I turned to leave, I heard a strange noise coming from inside the house. It sounded like someone whispering or murmuring, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I quickly got back into my car and drove away, feeling relieved to be out of that creepy house. I didn't think much of the encounter at first, but as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that I had felt at the house. I started having nightmares about the old woman and the strange noises I had heard. I couldn't stop thinking about her pale, gaunt face and the way she had stared at me with those empty eyes. One day, I decided to do some research and try to figure out who the old woman was and why she had made such an impression on me. I went online and looked up the address of the house, and to my surprise, I found out that it had a dark and tragic history. The house was built in 1910 and had been owned by a family named the DuPonts. They were a wealthy and respected family in the community. But in the 1920s, tragedy struck when their daughter, Marie DuPont, went missing. She was only 12 years old at the time, and her disappearance remains unsolved to this day. Rumors started to spread that Marie had been murdered by her own family and that her body was hidden somewhere on the property. The DuPonts were never charged with any crime, but they were shunned by the community and eventually moved away. The house remained empty for years until Mrs. DuPont came back to live there after her husband's death. She rarely left the house and never had any visitors. It was said that she was haunted by the ghost of her daughter, Marie, and that she could often be heard talking to her. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The old woman who had taken my pizza delivery was Mrs. DuPont, the mother of the missing girl, Marie. I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter and the tragic history of the house. I waited until the next night when I was off work and made my way back to the house. As I approached, I saw that the lights were on and I could hear someone talking inside. I knocked on the door and waited for a response. Mrs. DuPont answered the door, and I could see the recognition in her eyes. She seemed surprised to see me, but she didn't say anything. I nervously introduced myself and asked if I could come in and talk to her. She hesitated for a moment, but then nodded and let me in. I followed her into the living room, where she gestured for me to sit down. The room was dimly lit and filled with old, dusty furniture. Mrs. DuPont sat down across from me, and I could see the sadness in her eyes. She told me that she had been living alone in the house since her husband had passed away. She said that she could still hear Marie's voice, even though she had been gone for so many years. I listened to her story with a mix of sadness and fascination. Before leaving, I told her that I was sorry for her loss and that I understood why she was still living in the house. Mrs. DuPont thanked me for my understanding, and I felt a sense of closure. I left the house feeling a bit shaken, but also relieved that I had finally found out the truth about my encounter with her.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to stay tuned for more true stories.